intersection. And the frontage of this lot extends down the length of Arc Road. And this property is in Electoral Area B. The site is zoned I1C, light industrial, and this slide shows the zoning of the site and surrounding area. And Lot 4 is the last lot on Arc Road to be developed. And this entire area is within the South Cowichan Rural Development Permit Area. Therefore, a development permit is required before any development occurring. The applicant proposes to develop the site as a roofing and siding supply business. A showroom and 2 dome structures are proposed. The site also contains a significant amount of riparian areas that will be protected. And these riparian areas will also act as screening around the edges of the property. And this DP includes a variance to remove the screening requirements of the I1C zone in lieu of the protected riparian areas that already exist around much of the boundary. This slide includes the building elevations for the showroom building, and the designer has actually also brought a model which helps demonstrate the finished building. The proposed storage domes require height variances from 10 meters to 12.95 meters. These height variances, as well as the screening variance, have been supported by staff, which has been fully outlined in the staff report. And attached to the report, you would have also seen the detailed DPA assessment, and this attachment listed all the applicable DPA guidelines and considerations that have been reviewed for this project. So it is recommended that the application be approved, including the height and screening variances. And Mr. Chair, the applicant is in attendance and would also like the opportunity to make a presentation to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll consider that after the committee has asked questions of you, if there are any. Does Director Clement?
Recently, there was a similar variance done within the Cobble Hill Industrial Park, and because one of the potential uses, I know that we say that the business will be this, but we have to accept the fact that there can be a multitude of businesses here. Since one of them is auto work and the potential of petrochemicals, the APC asked for water oil separators on the paved areas, and I couldn't find that within the application. Did I just miss it, or has that been dealt with given its proximity to a riparian area?
Ms. Herrera.
Yeah, there are oil water separators for this, and it's on their plans. It was in the description and in their drainage plan too, so it was considered.
Any other questions for staff? Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was curious, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with what kind of standard letter would have gone out to the neighbors if it would describe that there would be a variance on the screen, because I know that that service road goes up to a few residents, so I'm wondering if they were aware of that.
Ms. Herrera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there was a kind of standard letter that's sent out with variances. It describes the section of the bylaw that applies for the variance and a description of what is to be varied. So that was sent out. There was one submission received, which was included in your package.
Any other questions for staff? Seeing none, Ms. Herrera, would you like to invite the applicant up? Could you tell us your name and how long are you needing to present the information that you have for us?
Just one moment, if I may.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Lucy. I'm a professional biologist, and I am representing the owner, Roof Mart, this afternoon. And we have two representatives from Roof Mart, Rob Strickland and his assistant, James Vogt. And then we have Mr. Phil Buchanan from J.E. Anderson, who is civil engineer in the project, and Dan Boot, who is the design engineer, and I'm the aquatic ecologist. So I would like to take about 5 minutes just to run you through some of the elements that went into the design and why the variance. I'm a Mac user, so this is new territory for me. As Sheila pointed out, the location is just off Shawnigan Lake Road, and there is a stream that flows through the property. There's a wetland that stream flows into, and then another stream flowing out underneath Ark Road, and that is a tributary of Van Horn Creek, and Van Horn, of course, is a tributary of Shawnigan Creek. You've seen where the property was outlined in Sheila's presentation, and of course here it is again. And just a point of interest, the road that is on the right-hand side of that blue rhomboid is actually a watershed boundary. So the arrow on the left, which is yellow dashed, that's the stream that flows through the property and ultimately into Van Horn. And on that right-hand side of the property is a gravel road. It's an access road for BC Hydro for their power lines, and it provides access to the property in behind. And everything on the right of that actually flows into Sanish Inlet. So this is a true watershed divide, and it's literally separated by that road. And it produced some very interesting discussions on the site. So as part of a much larger program that I've been running for a number of decades in the Shawnigan watershed, we undertook a rather detailed study of all of the creeks in the area, because most of them have fish in them. Contrary to a lot of popular belief in that area, there's a lot of fish in this area, and I've been working in this particular segment with one of my graduate students from the University of British Columbia. So we identified the stream and the wetland, and then conducted the necessary assessments to determine what the setbacks are. The setbacks in this particular case are those of the provincial government, not the CVRD, because this particular catchment is very, very small relative to your bylaws, which are based on a 2 square kilometer minimum, and this is about 0.1 of a square kilometer, very, very small indeed. It really only receives water from the property immediately above it. This is just an outline of the property showing where the major buildings are. And then the next set of photographs just show the property as you come around Shawnigan Lake Road. There's Ark Road in the background, and as you turn left to head towards the railroad tracks. And then that's, the bottom photograph is the same intersection, just looking to the northeast. And then these are just shots from Ark Road looking up onto the property itself. It was logged originally when the industrial development was laid out, and the property was left essentially abandoned for about a decade, and of course the invasives have moved in, dominated by red alder, broom, and gorse. This is the little wetland, so it receives water, surface flow for about 6 months of the year, and after that there's insufficient catchment above it to provide surface flow, but it does remain wet. And although this is probably not used to any extent by fish, it's very important in terms of amphibian habitat. We've documented all of that. The lower image on the right is simply looking at the culvert. There's an internal road that separates or connects the two parcels of land, which this stream separates. And that's the looking back up into that wetland. And of course, you can see that the principal influence in the past was logging / logging debris. This was taken in the winter just to give you a sense of the stream channel. So the culvert in that previous image was at the back end of this yellow dashed line, and the photograph is taken from Ark Road, another culvert going underneath, and that heads towards the south towards the railroad. You can see that there's very little vegetation on the property other than where there's moisture, and that's of course right beside the stream. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's a very large gorse plant community, very nasty invasive species. These are examples of the kind of building that Roof Mart is proposing to build. So it's a dome structure. And of course, the one in the bottom was a very generic image given when we submitted the original application, and Dan Boot has actually produced a model of what is actually intended to be built. This just to document that, in fact, the watercourse here is very, very small. As I say, it's about 90,000 square meters, which is why you only get water 3 or 4 months of the year during a normal year. The vegetative screen, we asked for a variance to produce that because of ecological reasons, and I'll just briefly go over those here. This is looking east towards Shawnigan Lake Road on Arc Road. There's a standard municipal drainage ditch on the left-hand side of this road. And the vegetation over the last decade has grown up there on what essentially are very thin rocky soils. I wouldn't even use the word soil, it's just rocky ground. It's extremely dry for about 7 or 8 months of the year. And so if we are proposing under the normal OCP requirement to take all that vegetation out and plant, then we're going to end up having to put in a lot of soil, then we're going to have to irrigate forever, which means we're now going to have to be drawing water from the well. So one of the challenges that I and my colleagues who are dealing with a climate change scenario is a much longer, drier summer, and everywhere we're looking, we're seeing water tables dropping. So we're trying to avoid the use of irrigation other than for the first year or two to get plants started, hence the request for a variance. And these images, again, are just ones that you've just seen. This is the one that Sheila just showed. I don't think we need to go into any more detail. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you, Patrick. We have a fairly exhaustive staff report. Turn to committee members and ask if you have any questions. Director Dory.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the applicant, what are the dome buildings for? What's the purpose of those dome buildings?
I can certainly get Rob Strickland to answer it. This is for roofing and cladding materials for buildings, so it's an industrial storage area. Yeah. Material is brought in, stored, and then contractors would come from the West Shore, principally, to come and pick up material for residential buildings.
So basically it's a warehouse, is it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good assessment,
Yeah.
Mr. Dory.
Any other directors have questions? Director Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just curious about your use of the term municipal ditches because they are, well, in an unincorporated area, and they are for the water coming off the Ministry of Transportation roads. So they're maintained by the ministry or their contractor main roads. So I was just wondering if you were planning on diverting water to them.
No, I'm using municipal in a generic sense,
Okay.
that they're not provincial or federal highway drainage channels. These are what we always see on the side of a road. And it actually goes back about 3,700 years because every road, by definition, is built the same way that either a Roman or a Babylonian would have built them, because they'd figure this out. You have to keep the water out of the center of the road or the road fails. So we typically pick up the sheet flow coming off the land into a drainage ditch, and then we divert it away from the road just to maintain the road. So I was using the word municipal just in a very generic sense. There's a very small quantity of water that flows off that road into that stream channel that goes under Arc Road. But the quality that we've looked at over the last 2 years has always been really good.
Okay,
It's a good question, but thank you.
Director Dory.
Yes, thank you. There's a couple of culverts. What's your opinion of the placement of those culverts? Were they done well, or they're hanging up in the air? It looks like that fish or even amphibians can't go through them very well. So, you know, are they on the property or are they on municipal land? Or
One is on the property. Yeah. That's the internal road. And that allows you to get from the east side of the property to the west side of the property. I think that one was installed reasonably well. I'll come back to the question because you've asked an extremely important question. And the one under the road seems to be functioning properly. And they appear to be sized correctly. I have an engineer here who can perhaps provide more information on that. I think the challenge, Director, is that historically we rarely ever built culverts properly. Culverts should have about 40% of the bottom portion of the culvert buried with the stream material. Unfortunately, most engineers just treated them as a way to get water from one place to another. Sorry, Phil. And generally speaking, if we have large quantities of water to divert under a road, engineers have typically put in an array, but all at the same level, when in fact they should be in the form of a V. So one at the bottom, and that's only to transport sediment. The other two, which would be much higher, would be to transport high volumes of water that aren't carrying sediment during a big flood event. And so it's a pet peeve of mine as an ecologist. I see no inclination by the engineer to come up and throttle me or comment, but I think they're adequate.
Okay.
Thank you. Director Dory, turn off your mic. Director Yanni DiNardo to close.
Thank you. I was interested in the Ministry of Transportation culverts and the idea that that's still all the tributaries are very important for the fish. They all serve a purpose. Will the Ministry of Transportation, or do you request if they're going to adapt that or change the ones that are there currently? Like after your research, just helping them out
Right.
on what's happened on that property and the value of that property, would that be helpful to share that with Ministry of Transportation?
Yes, and we've already done that. Interestingly enough, if you remember an early slide where I said there's two watersheds, so it's almost like standing in the Rocky Mountains, and 1 foot goes to the Atlantic and 1 foot goes to the Pacific. Well, here 1 foot goes to Mill Bay and the other one goes down into Saanich Inlet. If you follow the stream on the right-hand side, the east side of that property, it follows old logging roads and some old industrial works. And then it flows along beside Shawnigan Lake Road, and then it flows under the culvert. It rarely ever goes into the culvert. And that culvert is perched higher than the height of this room. So when they rebuilt Shawnigan Lake Road, they just put in a massive oversized culvert, and they've completely and totally disconnected the lower portion of the watershed to the upper portion of the watershed. The challenge is to replace that would be enormously difficult
But
because
you've
of that
shared-
height difference.
But you've shared that with
Oh, yes,
them.
yeah,
And that's
yeah.
really important.
We have a number of projects that we've been working on around the bridges and debris jams and that sort of thing. And yeah, so we've been speaking directly with Ministry of Highways with their fisheries biologist. Yeah.
Great.
So, and with Main Road, I should say, and also with Main Road. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Seeing no other hand, Director Clement.
Sorry, I'm not too sure if you have a person to speak to about the drainage components.
It depends on the question, sir.
Sorry. I'm noticing on the drainage plan that it has 6 catch basins. I'm assuming they're the hexagon that are dotted all over the map, and all of that drains into the water streams there. Is that my understanding?
No, the surface drainage, because it will be paved, drains to 2 large engineered rock pits is a common term, but they're actually more complicated than that in this case. And I raised the concern with the Ministry of Environment about the need to maximize the in-ground treatment. And because the site was so badly damaged, just because it was logged off, I mean, let's just call it what it was, there's no riparian zone on that little stream channel. There's a fabulous riparian and wetland, but not in the stream that comes out. And so they've enabled me to expand the in-ground disposal of that water into what we would normally not be permitted to go into, which is the riparian zone, to substantially enhance the treatment on both sides of the creek.
And
Follow up?
And that has been authorized in writing by the ministry.
Okay, I'm
Yep.
familiar with the rock pits that you're talking about. And so back to my previous question
Mm-hmm.
to staff about the oil water separators, do those come before those rock pits?
Oh,
Those are
yes, yes,
maintained by
yeah,
the
oh, yes, yeah,
property owners?
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Tippett, would you read the recommended resolution, please?
That it be recommended to the board, firstly, that development permit application number 04B17DP/VAR for Lot 4 Arc Road be approved. Number 2, that zoning bylaw number 985, section 11.4B2 be varied from 10 meters to 12.95 meters. And that section 11.4B5 be varied to remove the screening requirements along the eastern boundary due to an existing right-of-way, and to remove the requirements along the remaining boundaries as the majority of the boundaries contain protected riparian areas. And thirdly, that the general manager of land use services be authorized to permit minor revisions to the permit in accordance with the intent of the development permit guidelines of official community plan bylaw number 3510.
Thank you, Mr. Tippett. Moved by Director Acton, seconded by Director Clement. Any discussion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion carries. Items recommended to the board will go to our next board meeting on Wednesday, March 28th. Next item, I believe we're going to Ms. Soroka for this one. Okay. We have Jack Fleetwood Trail License Agreement. Okay, I've actually got Mr. Farquhar for that one, but he's not in the room. Mr. Tippett, would you like to take this one?
Reluctantly, yes. I don't really know anything about it, but it sounds like a standard trail license agreement renewal. And I expect that it's just doing business to keep our trails and walkways open.
Whose electoral area is that in?
Jack Fleetwood. I don't even know that. Tanya probably does.
Director Acton.
That was part of my question, because I was surprised to see it here, where it starts right at the bottom of the trestle, right under the structure. So I was curious why it was in electoral area services. Is that considered Area B then?
Ms. Soroka.
Okay.
I knew I'd get you up there.
I'll make an attempt to answer these questions.
Please do.
Jack Fleetwood Trail is in electoral area B, and it used to connect through before the trestle was rehabilitated, and it's actually on Island Timberlands land.
But so it's funded by Area B then, it's not funded through regional parks like the trestle. And I'm curious, why are we just doing 2 years?
We have been maintaining a 2-year license agreement with him for years, and it's just a matter of not being able to get a longer agreement.
They won't give it to us, because that's a lot of paperwork every 2 years.
Yes.
Maybe we could ask for more this year.
we
Put a
tried.
0 at the end.
Mr. Tippett, would you read the recommendation?
That it be recommended to the board that a 2-year extension for 2018 through 2020 of the Jack Fleetwood Trail License Agreement with Island Timberlands LP be executed.
Moved by Director Acton, seconded by Director Davis. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Next item. Is that Mr. McDonald? R3, R4, Mr. McDonald. Bylaw enforcement, no, building inspection. Hang on. Floor is yours.
I've got some slides to go with the report, but I'll just give them verbally.
Please do.
This is the building inspection report for February. It was a short month, so I'll keep it a short report.
Can I have director's attention, please?
There's a chart here that I was hoping to show, but I'll just quickly read off it because there's only a few points on this one. I had the construction values for all the electoral areas, but I can just give you the highlights that Area B is leading the way at 42%.
Can I ask you to just stop for a second? Is there any other directors having technical difficulties pulling up? Well, mine's frozen. I don't have anything on screen.
Frozen too.
I don't want to download. Hang on, Ian. Does anybody want to take a break for 5 minutes? Let them get it sorted out?
Yes, that would be good.
Okay, let's take 5 minutes.
And then so on and so forth through the various areas. As for our highs and lows for our department, we've issued 37 permits in February, and the average from 2007 is usually about 29, so we're well ahead of our average. Our department goals have always been, this year has been training, and I have 2 inspectors this month taking a ventilation course. Our also goal is to close old files as time permits, but as permits are being generated fairly heavily already, we're having a struggle with that one. The total construction values for the month were just over $6 million, and for the year, $12 million. New housing starts, we had 18 in the month for a total of 32 for this year. And for the building permits issued, 37 for February, that's 72 total for the year, which is the best since 2010, and the second best in 10 years. Thank you very much, and I'll answer any questions if you have them.
Any questions for Mr. McDonald? Boy, you're getting off easy.
I like it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, Mr. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would like to present the bylaw enforcement report for the month of February. This is new for me, so please be kind. I will do my best to explain, but I may not have full answers about absolutely everything that's gone on with enforcement over the last month. Not seeing the slides here at the proper location.
No, that's Mike's.
Okay, I will speak to the slides that are in your report.
Excellent.
So in February, there were 15 new enforcement files that were opened. That is a little bit lighter than what's been typical in the past. The distribution of those files is relatively even across the 9 electoral areas. There was a little bit more activity in Area D than is typical, and a little bit less in Area E than has been typical in the past. In terms of the issues that were encountered, about half of those files are to do with zoning and development permit issues, and the remainder deal with a variety of things: aggressive dogs, unsightly premise. There were some drainage issues and burning issues, outdoor burning. There's a slide in your package that indicates the geographic distribution of the new bylaw enforcement files. Those are distributed approximately where the population is. So there's more activity in the southern area, out at the lake, along the shoreline of Cowichan Lake, and a little bit up at the north. I wanted to take this opportunity to speak a little bit about what the bylaw enforcement division does and how it's organized, there are 2 enforcement officers within that division. Those positions are funded by building. One of the positions is funded exclusively from the building inspection budget, and the other position is funded by parks, 50% by parks and 50% solid waste. And so those are the essentially where those the funds for enforcement are coming from those 3 function areas. Much of what the enforcement officers do go beyond simply building and parks monitoring, that kind of thing, and dealing with solid waste issues. So there's a bit of an issue there that I think at some point we're going to have to come back and talk a little bit more about. Approximately 50% of their time is spent out in the field and 50% in the office. When they're in the office, they're dealing with things like preparing reports, writing letters to the property owners about various issues. They're entering data, dealing with front counter inquiries, responding to phone calls. On occasion, they're working with our legal counsel and undertaking investigation work that they can do from the office. The other 50% is spent out in the field where they're investigating complaints. They're doing parks and trails patrols. That's part of what Rob Harris in particular does, is he's out in the parks regularly checking those parks. They're meeting with other agencies. One thing that they do increasingly now is they're delivering notices as well. So there's various notices that the Land Use Services Department issues, things like rezoning notices and notices for variances. The enforcement officers are now doing those deliveries rather than the planners. And each of the enforcement officers logs about 1,000 kilometers a month on their vehicles in these travels that they do. Just a few more stats for you. In the month of February, there were 350 inquiries of various sorts that were dealt with. And as I mentioned, there were 15 files that resulted from those. The total files to date for the first 2 months of the year are 39, and they're dealing with about 43 active files that date back into 2017, and a few of them even further than that that they're working on as ongoing enforcement files. A couple of highlights I wanted to mention. We're now into the burning window, or the time of the year when residents can undertake outdoor burning in most of the electoral areas. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, but that actually generates more complaints than we get during the non-burning window season, largely because a lot of people do the burning and they're not following the venting index. So we're having to do a lot of work with property owners around educating them about when they can actually legally burn. Another noteworthy item, the dog control contract that the CVRD has recently changed. So for the previous contract, which dealt with the last 3 years, was with the SPCA, and the SPCA has provided dog control services for, I think, close to the last 2 decades for the regional district. That recently changed, and Coastal Animal Control Services is now providing dog control based on their competitive bid that they put in on this contract. So there's a bit of work involved in doing this transition, because we're now dealing with a new service provider for dog control, and there's a few changes needed around that. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention the work that the enforcement officers do around drainage issues. So there's an increasing amount of their time is spent dealing with issues around drainage and siltation and issues with streams and that sort of thing. As Director Acton will know, there's a particular problem in the South Shawnigan area where there's a number of sites where there's been excessive fill placed, and those are creating issues, and our enforcement officers are part of the group of authorities that are trying to get a handle on that. So they're working with other agencies on those issues. So that's basically concludes my presentation. I did want to end with a question for the committee, though. For the past 2 years or so, I think it's been common that there's been a monthly report brought forward to this committee. And what I'd like to ask is whether that format is the preferred way of delivering this information, or perhaps you'd like to go to another format such as a quarterly report, where we could provide more information, maybe drill down a bit more deeply as to what's happening out there in the bylaw enforcement world. Do it less frequently, but more information, or do you prefer to have this monthly format and continuing on with what's been done in the past? So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd appreciate hearing them.
Thank you. I've got a speakers list of Director Yanni DiNardo, Acton, Davis, and Kuhn. So Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Rob. I also, the quarterly, I think if we could drill down would be valuable, because then we can have fulsome discussion. I also, it says in here that there's higher license sales. Is that just an anomaly, or do you think it has something to do with the new contractor?
Yes, with dog licenses, there has been quite a bit of work done.
Yeah, that's true before with.
Recently around trying to publicize the requirements around dog licenses, and I think that's starting to pay some dividends in terms of the uptake on the licensing. So I would probably attribute that more to the advertising and work done than the new contractor.
Follow up.
And then the outdoor burning, which is a huge issue, which we're going to hear more from the Fresh Air Committee or whatever, I forget their exact name, but the venting index is really not even working. This is too big of a region, and they just, we're so isolated in all the different areas that you can't even keep up, even if it's for venting, nobody's following it, not even the ALR. So I think that we're going to be, this committee is going to be quite surprised on the health issues that we now have the 13 monitors in the area and what's been happening. So when we get that further detail, which I think is coming in June, there'll be a lot more discussion, I'm sure, on this burning, because I really believe that we're heading in the direction where there's no ban on all burning. Thank you.
Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question, and I would like to answer your question, but first I'll start with my question. I'm curious, can you just, I'm glad you're explaining the bylaw enforcement rules and how they spend their day, but so when do they write a ticket? When does that ever happen, or what's the scenario there?
Mr. Conway.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I'll try to take a crack at that. So enforcement officers have a variety of tools at their disposal for trying to deal with infractions, and the ticketing is one of them. So there's typically a kind of a progression of enforcement that goes on when they're dealing with an infraction, and depending on the nature of the infraction, if it's not something that can be reasonably resolved, often the first action is just requesting that the person cease doing whatever the activity is before they escalate. So if, for example, one of the compliance officers or enforcement officers is out in a park and they see somebody with a cigarette, the first step isn't to give them a ticket for having a cigarette. The first, typically they would ask them to please put it out and inform them that there's a bylaw requirement that there's no smoking within the parks. If they encounter that individual again, and maybe after a second warning, they're continuing, or a third warning, they see that person again continuing on, at that point it may be appropriate to issue a ticket. And there's a fair bit of judgment involved in when to apply a ticket or when to use other mechanisms. Ticketing isn't an approach that's available for all violations. So, for example, if somebody does clearing in a riparian area, we're not able to issue tickets for those kinds of things. So ticketing is only usable for certain types of violations. As I've said, it's really reserved for those situations where people are not complying voluntarily, and we're seeing indications that they're not willing to comply, and then we have to escalate it through the issuance of tickets.
Director Acton, did you have a follow-up?
Thank you. So it's not used very often, probably.
I would say that, yeah, we don't, if we were to look at how many tickets are issued, there's not a lot of them. There's probably, I can't even
Don't
say,
guess.
but it's a handful in a year,
Okay.
this kind of thing.
And then back to your question about what kind of report to present. Personally, I don't find that these give you a lot. I would like to hear more of a kind of personal rendition about what's happened, what kind of calls that people are finding they're getting, so that you could, so I see here there's 350 calls, but there's only, sorry, I gotta go back to it, 30 files opened. So there must be a lot of calls that are coming in that are not CVRD, or you probably have trends, just as we do too. We get certain calls as trends. So just knowing those trends, and then knowing who you're sending people to for certain things, what you're seeing. So just more of like almost a verbal report than spending all this time mapping and giving a whole bunch of detail, which I'm sure takes a lot of time to execute. I would like to see things, well, if we could discuss it, I just think there's a few other things that would be interesting to know. Then we could actually talk to our constituents and say, well, no, don't call CVRD about this, call so-and-so. And because then you could see that the public's misinformed, or, because it's frustrating for people to be calling the wrong place anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
So might I suggest, for the purposes of we should have a separate discussion. It's just been posed to us, and I think we should have, take a few days and week or two to think about it, and schedule it for an upcoming meeting for a discussion. Perhaps staff could bring us some alternatives and pros and cons as to the different reporting options that there might be. So why don't we leave that for another meeting? I'll go back to my list. We have Director Davis, Kuhn, Nicholson, and Dory. Director Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to ask what other kinds of information they would be able to provide in the report. So I guess that could go with that.
Excellent, thank you. Director Kuhn.
Yes, I think a more detailed report quarterly would be my preference. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Nicholson.
Thank you. Yep, a quarterly report would be fine. But I, in general, think we need a program review of the enforcement program. I think we really need to drill down into what the strengths and weaknesses, what's working and what isn't working. And I think that there's questions around resourcing. Questions around whether some of these bylaws that they're trying to enforce are up to date, or like the burning one makes no sense to me. And I think there's a huge education communication component that we don't really do at all well. So I think that the fact that we don't understand how your program works very well is, I mean, the public certainly won't know that. And so that's important, and for them to understand it, and for us to understand what our approach, whether our approach is working, this complaint-driven, and I know you can't get away completely from complaint-driven, but I think we need to think about what's really material, and where are you going to spend your resources, and what's really important to the community well-being, and so you can set your priorities on those kind of things. And I'd really like to see us do a good review of this program, because it's been sort of a bit of a concern since I started, and I know we've talked about it all the time, but we don't really get to the nub of it.
If I could respond, I think everybody knows I'm new to this role, and this is definitely on my work plan for this year, is to do a review and to bring that back and have further discussions about everything that Director Nicholson just mentioned. So you can expect to have that later this year.
Thank you. Director Dory.
I did have a tricky question lined up, but I think I'll retract it now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further questions for Mr. Conway?
Okay.
I thought you retracted it.
In answer to your question, I think, yeah, only the tricky. In answer to your question about quarterly would be fine with me, because directors can always contact the bylaw officers or request that they be notified if you want to get more thoroughly involved in and the messes that happen in your community. So I think quarterly is fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conway. Next item, function 469, Mr. Takarik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just a budget amendment report for a Community Works Fund project, the Kokosila ecosystem-based analysis. This is just to amend the 2018 budget to include the $15,000 that's already been approved to the Cowichan Station Area Association.
All right, we have question, Director Kuhn.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, this is earmarked for Kokosila Watershed Ecosystem-Based Analysis Project. I'm curious, how much money are we spending on the Kokosila watershed? I thought we had a budget approved there, what was it, $90,000 or whatever? And so is there more and more money being funneled into that? And I'd just like to hear some kind of explanation for that.
I believe this is connected to the OCP work that's being done in Electoral Area E. Is that correct, Director Nicholson?
Yes, and this was an approval that happened, I think, quite a long time ago as part of the BEMREIT directors were requested for grant and aid funding. And I think when Director Furstenau was at the table, she elected to use gas tax money instead of grant and aid money.
Do you have a follow-up, Director Kuhn?
Is that somehow in coordination with that whole assessment of the watershed plan? I'm just curious, how much is the total amount of money we're spending on there?
So
Director Nicholson?
So the project itself is $90,000 plus GST, which was the CSAA is fundraising all the money. So they requested grants and aid from directors. They received a large grant from the Real Estate Foundation, another grant from Sydney Anglers. So our portion is just a part of it.
Is that part of the 90,000?
As part of the 90,000.
Okay, thanks.
But it's none of your money. Director Davis.
I think the piece that was missing in this, if I'm correct, is that this is money that was not spent in 2017, and you have to amend the budget so it can be spent in 2018.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Any further questions for staff? Mr. Tippett, would you please read the recommended resolution?
That it be recommended to the board, number one, that the 2018 budget for function 469, Cowichan Station Association, I think that's Cowichan Station Area Association, Area E, be amended to, firstly, increase the grant to the organization by $15,000, and secondly, to increase the transfer from gas tax reserve by $15,000, and secondly, that function 469, Cowichan Station Area Association, Area E 2018 budget amendment be authorized to proceed prior to adoption of the 2018 budget amendment.
Turn to the director for the area. Somebody going to move it? Moved by Director Nicholson, seconded by Director Acton. Any further discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion carries. Next item, R7, report from Director Kuhn. Director Kuhn?
Yes, that it be recommended to the board that a financial donation contribution equivalent to the cost of materials and labor for a 20 by 20 foot picnic shelter be accepted from Laketown Ranch, with a donation applied to the Electoral Area I Community Parks for capital improvement investment at the parkside in a parkside in the community. The reason this.
Gotta have a seconder first. Seconded by Director Nicholson. Do you want to speak to it, Director Kuhn?
Yeah, the reason this came up is because Laketown Ranch agreed to construct a picnic shelter in Mile 77 Park, and subsequently we decided to close down that park for this year, so that kind of shelved this whole project. And I've been in contact with Greg Adams and and we agreed that he will just write a check and we'll put that into the capital projects for Area I. And if we decide to open that park again, then we'll construct a shelter there. If not, then it'll go into Arbutus Park. Thank you.
Any questions on the resolution? Director Clement?
Has this been, has this gone to the Parks Commission? Okay.
Follow up?
And you're saying Mile 77 Park is just closed down for this year? What happened there? I haven't heard about this.
Well, the park has never really been visited. I mean, I go through there every summer. I bike by there, and there's nobody ever there. It's and the reason it hasn't been frequented by the public is mainly because there's no shelter and because there's no beach. So you have to kind of walk through the bush in order to get to the water. And so we evaluated that whole situation. We thought, well, okay, to maintain that park, the cost was roughly about, I think, $11,000 or $12,000. And so we decided we'll cut that out for this year, and we'll go to the public. And I would like to open this whole issue up to the public because Area I has by far the most parkland of any area in comparison to the number of citizens. So I'd like to get that whole thing opened up and say, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to maintain all these parks, and most likely we'll have to increase taxes, or is there another avenue? And so this is what's starting this off.
Director Dory?
Thank you. So this money would be used for capital, whether it's on 77 or Arbutus. And which park is closest to the Lake Town Ranch?
Director Kuhn?
Yeah.
That would be mile 77, yes.
Yeah.
And that Forest Service Park. That's
There's another one there?
yeah, there's another one.
Okay, thank you.
I just had a quick question. You've run this through your Parks Commission. Is there any, for lack of a better term, strings attached or priorities that these funds must be directed to, as opposed to just a general capital account?
Well, I promised Greg Adams that we won't build washrooms with it. He insisted on that. He thinks it should be a picnic shelter or something like this. He says, I'm not going to finance washrooms. And I said, no, you won't.
So I guess just as a follow-up, what have you put in place to ensure that a picnic shelter or like structure follows these funds through through the budget? We don't know what'll happen after October 20th and whether or not you'll have the same Parks Commission members. Sometimes the corporate knowledge gets lost. So have you got something in place to, or have you got a special line item set up in the budget so that these are directed to a like facility?
Yeah, I don't know if we actually nailed it down, but the understanding is that it will be a picnic shelter. If we open up mile 77 Park again, it'll be there. If not, then it'll be in Arbutus Park.
So do you feel that this resolution captures what your desires of your commission is? Okay. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, UB1, Mr. Tippett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I missed the committee meeting, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, at which the annual report was presented. I understand there were some questions concerning some of the statistics that were shown in the report, and so now I've excerpted a few of the slides that are part of the report to use as the basis of a quick summary and discussion of the content of the report. There were essentially two halves to it. The first half is dealing with planning applications. The second half approximately is dealing with building permit applications. So I'm going to ask Rob Conway to take care of the second half. So we'll start off with official community plan and zoning bylaw amendment. This chart, I think, shows a reasonable plan. So we'll take a close look at that and see if we're getting good value for the effort expended there, and report back to committee on that in due course. Variance applications, again, spiked around 2007 and have been kind of steady-ish since then at 15 to 20 per year, somewhere in that range typically. Not much more to say about that really. Board of variance, this is the weirdest looking chart really. It's it's very sporadic, and the scale is 0 to 3, so we never did have a lot of applications to the Board of Variance in recent years. Interestingly, if you go way back in time, we didn't have development variance permit powers for probably 30 years ago. This is a bit out of sync with that, and I think that's the reason why.
Okay, just wanted to make sure I was understanding. So seeing this, and we know that there's an increased workload associated with that, I am curious to know where the developer's handbook is in the queue right now, because this, and what I'm hearing from small mom and pop people trying to just subdivide their property, or a business trying to get something, they're just lost in the process. One business has now had to apply for a variance twice when they could have applied for it at the same time, not knowing that cost the money. I'm really interested, and I think this graph illustrates why we need material for the public instead of them always having to come in and take up staff time to do that. And we've even cut back staff time at the front desk because our workload is my understanding. So I'm curious to know if you or your superior are putting that anywhere higher at the list, because this is really showing, I'm sure 2018 is going to be a higher year again.
Mr. Tippett?
Mr. Chair, yes, I alluded to that earlier in my general comments. We are planning to undertake a bit of a review of development permit processes generally, which I think gets at your comments about the thresholds concerning the triggering of development permit requirements. You know, like maybe for single lot subdivisions in certain circumstances, we don't need to really, or let's put it this way, we don't derive sufficient benefit from a development permit process to justify the effort that both the applicant and ourselves have to go through for it. So we're going to do a bit of a performance based measurement of development permits generally, report back to committee, and maybe make changes to the requirements generally to perhaps diminish some of the workload. And then the other part of your comment, you know, concerning a developer's handbook, yeah, that's definitely still on the radar somewhere, but I think it's almost more of a priority to get that initial screening of, or let's say performance review done, just to make sure that we're, you know, before we're developing a handbook that might make reference to a bunch of stuff that later gets adjusted or thrown out. Let's get our development permits sort of lined up properly first. And so that's one of the main targets in our what's it called, bylaw amalgamation project, is the development permits, the guidelines, getting them consistent throughout the region insofar as we have development permit areas, making sure the guidelines are consistent and that the exemptions are consistent and that makes sense, and that we're going to get good public benefit from efforts expended. And so I suspect what will happen is that may reduce the number of permits that are required, and then we can move on to okay, now we know what we're doing with DPs, let's write a guideline, or a guidebook rather, for the people who are going to have to apply.
Director Acton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I liked your explanation. That makes sense. By looking at these charts, 2007 looks like an extremely busy year that had a big outcome. And then looking at the numbers now, would it be fair to say that there was more work being done then and less staff? Or because that's what it kind of looks like by the charts. Maybe you could explain that a bit.
Mr. Tippett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's good of you to notice that, because as I think I noted before, the bulk of those development permit applications in 2007 were riparian areas regulation DPs. And as you know, we don't bring those development permits to committee. We don't do reports. They're basically signed off by the general manager. So there's a lesser workload associated with those because we don't have to prepare reports. They're not part of the agenda. The planners don't have to prepare reports for this committee and so on. And yeah, there was a lesser workload despite the higher number. Now, a portion of the current workload is those type of permits as well, but I think it's a lot lower proportion than you see in the 2007 statistic.
Sorry, just to clarify then, I just mean everything in general though, where you had subdivisions, et cetera. It looked like there would have been a lot more work being done in 2007 with lots of permitting.
Oh, I see. You weren't just talking about development permits. Mr. Chair, yeah, what has changed is we were incredibly busy in 2007. Rob, when did you start working here? I forget. 2008? Yeah. We were unable to process those applications. We just came to gridlock, and Tom Anderson, who was the general manager at that time, decided that I needed help trying to do all this stuff, and so Rob was brought on, and he graciously took over development services, and we made some headway there. But the fact that all those applications came in that year doesn't mean they were dealt with that year. In fact, a lot of them weren't. That was part of the challenge. I think we were more backlogged then than we are now, certainly for the major applications like rezoning. But yeah, it's a good observation.
Mr. Conway?
Yes, one other relevant point I'd like to make. At that time, there was almost no kind of policy work being done or longer range planning work being done. All of the people employed in the planning department at that time were working on applications, and as a result, the OCP work was sitting for quite a while. So the department has evolved since that time, and there's been the structure where development services is now dealing with applications, and then there's the community regional planning division that's dealing with policy work. And that's largely a result of what happened around this time in 2007, when all of the OCP work was shelved and dealing with this kind of influx of applications. So it might look from the stats that there was more work being done with less staff at that time, but the staff that was there wasn't doing the same work. They were all development applications.
Director Davis, and I've got myself after.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm so glad to hear that you're reviewing which areas need to be in a development permit area. It's still shocking to me the amount of time that could have been saved if all of Area D hadn't been a development permit area. I can't imagine that every property really needs one, so thank you.
And my question is sort of along those lines, but on a more macro scale with the harmonization of our policies and the likes. I know that my OCP steering committee has worked very hard to not expand the regulatory regime for doing business in my electoral area. And so I just want to be sure that we're not going to in the process of this harmonization, embed development permit regimes that are in existence in some electoral areas into other areas that may not want to participate in that.
Mr. Chair, certainly not, and you're not alone probably with that thought, I would think. I would know, actually. So we certainly, the goal is if you are going to have a certain type of development permit area, that the guidelines associated with that are the same or similar, very similar to those in other electoral areas that have the same kind of DPA. But it doesn't mean that all areas will have the same DPAs. So we're just trying to make sure that, where a rule does exist, that it's consistent across the region.
You're going to call Mr. Conway up next, apparently. Do you want Mr. Tippett or Mr.
Tippett.
Conway? Okay.
Just a quick question.
Director Nicholson.
So that Board of Variance thing, what would go to a Board of Variance
Mr. Chair?
currently?
Sorry, what was that last word?
Currently.
Currently?
Things have changed, so do we need it at all?
Well, we're legally required to have one according to the legislation if we have a zoning bylaw, and we have lots of zoning bylaws, so we should have a Board of Variance. What can go to a Board of Variance is anything that comes before this board as a development variance permit, plus matters that this board does not have the ability to deal with, like expansions to legal non-conforming use, and one or two other things related to that. So there's certainly some overlap with the powers between this elected board and the appointed board. If I can think of one example at Shawnigan Lake where there was an expansion to a legal non-conforming use that a Board of Variance adjudicated and actually approved. But that's very rare. And so that power doesn't exist here. So if someone wanted to do something like that, we would have to reestablish the Board of Variance and send it there. The problem with referring all, let's say any variance application to the Board of Variance first is, I already mentioned, they're appointed by the board and they're not directly accountable to the electorate, and so they're making decisions and, you know, might not be putting the same depth of thought as this committee would into it. And so those applications, those few applications that blipped up on the chart when I was on that page were, I think for the most part, things that went before this board first as a development variance permit, and the answer was no, and then they appealed to the Board of Variance, and I think in most cases the answer there also was no. But yeah, there's certainly an overlap, and it's a rarely used function at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So these next slides deal with building permit applications. New housing starts are probably the best indicator of the workload that the building inspectors deal with. Much of their inspection work is involved with new homes, or there's more inspections, more of a process, more complexity with dealing with new homes than other kinds of permits. So this slide shows the trend over the last decade or more. Much like Mr. Tippett was saying, that there was a spike of development activity in 2007. So at that time, the housing starts were up generally, and then they tapered off slowly down to about 2013, and they've been on the upswing since then. So that's been the general trend. I think it's interesting to note that the changes are not dramatic. There's a general sort of level of building activity that's gone on over this period. This next slide shows the number of residential building permits. So this is not only new home starts, it's dealing with all types of residential building permits, including additions, that sort of thing. It follows a similar pattern. And then here we have a slide that shows the value of the residential permits that are issued, and they're increasing over time. And I think part of that's due to the both the number of permits, but also to the sort of inflation or the increase in values of construction over time. Commercial building permits, again, back in 2005 to 2008, there was quite a high level of commercial building activity. That did slow down. It's slowly been increasing over time, but hasn't reached those same levels. Values. And this shows industrial building permits. They're a bit more flashy. That they do vary depending on the economic climate and various other factors. I think one of the determinants of these kinds of permits is the availability of industrial land, and there isn't a lot of industrial land, we're hearing it, that's available right now, which might be having some impact on the number of permits. And the institutional building permits are interesting. We don't do a lot of them, but they often have very high values, and that's because a number of the institutions in our region, such as Brentwood College or Shawnigan School, have been doing quite a bit of building in recent years, and the value of those buildings are very high. So when there's a building permit taken out for a new dormitory, for example, usually that's a very high number, and that doesn't reflect in this slide in terms of the number of permits, but in the values, they do have quite an impact, those expensive buildings. So we'll sometimes see a real spike that goes up in a year, and that's generally because there's been a large institutional building that's been built in that year. We also track permits for agricultural buildings. Those values are generally quite a bit less. And I think this is the last slide. It just shows the total number of building permits issued. So again, following this kind of pattern where there was a high level of building activity in the mid-aughts, and then it tapered off, and then it's starting to increase in the last few years. So. That concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Conway. Any questions for Mr. Conway? Excellent. Thank you very much. We go to our next item, which is new business. I believe there were some handouts at your seat. First item is the Union of BC Municipalities Resolution Response Highways Maintenance. If you would kindly flip to the side 2, just to give you a bit of background, not at last year's, maybe it was at last year's AVICC, we were informed that highways maintenance contracts were up for renewal or retendering, and highways wasn't necessarily forthcoming as to which and when, but it was expressed at the AVICC convention that the local governments have some input into some of the measurements, some of the standards, that sort of thing. Resolution went through to Union of BC Municipalities, where the resolution was endorsed, was sent to the province, and you see at the bottom, or midway in the page 2, the provincial response. Pretty typical provincial response. Look at all our staff, look at all of our monitoring records and audits and the likes. But I think the thing that caught the ire of some of the AVICC executive and myself as well was the sentence, that second sentence in the last paragraph. Mayors and councillors are encouraged to share their comments and concerns with our local highway staff and maintenance contractors. Now, near as I can tell, our municipal partners look after their own roads, and the provincial highways are in the electoral areas. And apparently, I have to go and see Mr. Mayor Forrest about some of the issues in my area. I guess Klaus would as well. So I was just wanting to bring this to everyone's attention and ask if there might be some thought as to responding to this, or sending a letter off to our Minister of MOTI, Ministry of Transportation Infrastructure, Trevenna. Any thoughts? Throwing it out there, we could consider it the next meeting if you want to think about it a little bit. Director Marcotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's well worth...
Microphone, please.
It's well worth exploring the issue more fully than we have done so far, and certainly I think it's worthwhile to let the highways and let the ministry know that we have some issues that we need resolving, and not waiting until the municipalities resolve it for us. So I would like to move ahead with that.
All right, Director Clement, followed by Kuhn.
This letter kind of puts the onus, I guess, on the contractor component. And I find our current contractor is exceptional in responding to issues, especially very large potholes or any. The response and their quality of work isn't of question. It's their response to us quite often, which is budget, money. So we can go down this path around the contractors, or we can emphasize, that's fine, the contractor is doing their job, and yes, you are checking on them, but the real issue here is the funding for the contractors to do the work that we know needs doing. It's really easy to clear out our area budget really quickly. I mean, over just across the train tracks on Thane Road, which is technically Shawnigan Lake, it all got paved. It's beautiful. It's awesome. It's sucked up the whole budget for paving in the area, which is fine. It really needed to be done. It was in really bad shape. But then, again, it comes down to how much dollars the contractor's getting. So depending on which way we want to go, I think it's more about how much is being provided for the roads, for the contractors to do the work.
Thanks. Director Kuhn?
Yeah, that sentence there, that irked me too. And I think we should set them straight. Just kind of casually let them know that, no, it's electoral areas that really have to worry about working with highways. It's not the municipalities. I think that would be a fair move. Thanks.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear that there's good maintenance being done in Director Clement's area. I know that they don't seem to want to head out to the western part of our region as often as my residents would like, so I'm just wondering if it would be appropriate to have a motion to the effect that a letter be written and that it be submitted to the board and sent off.
Yeah, I move to that effect.
Seconded by Director Marcotte. Any, Director Nicholson?
I'd also think that they didn't answer A in their response. Because, you know, I spend a lot of my job time fielding public questions about road stuff. And so I think that really that's important, and I certainly agree with Director Clements. The way the whole resolution was worded, it allowed them to weasel out of providing us some idea of how they measure whether they're putting enough budget in to actually maintain the roads. So I think those points could be raised too. I think we really need to press on this because roads are just a mess.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that I'll work with staff at crafting something. Would you like it to come back for review before it's sent out, or? Okay, I see a nod, yes. Director Clement?
If I am to understand Director Kuhn and your situation, as well as the Thane Road might be a good one, is I'm finding also in areas where there's high industrial activity, whether they be agriculture or otherwise, conventional industrial parks perhaps, those roads really get beaten up really bad, and I feel like it's not being, I don't know how to word it. I don't know if those resources from that tax base is being put into the infrastructure that's being fixed in those areas. And I'd like that highlighted because I don't know what that looks like in terms of a taxation scheme or resourcing, but definitely in those areas I've seen it where industrial roads are just horrid and they never get fixed.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands, I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. And just interesting note, I have a meeting with the South Coast, I don't even know what her title is, Senior Manager below Assistant Deputy Minister tomorrow morning, and this is going to be something we're going to talk about, so that's one of a number of items. Next item on the agenda is another AVICC related request, and this is from our electoral area representative on the AVICC executive. We've had a number, 2 or 3 years now, I think we've hosted an electoral area forum at AVICC, and which we are doing again this year. And Director Wynn has asked if we had any topic suggestions that we would like to submit for consideration. I gather they'll be submitted, and the top 2 will be brought forward at the electoral area forum at the convention in April. So would we like to do this as a group or individual suggestions? I think the contact information is on the reverse. So once again, this is just an item to bring to your attention. What's the committee think about this one? Director Nicholson.
Well, I think we should think all together about what we think are the important issues that we'd like to move forward. And I would certainly, I think one of the issues for us is the cannabis thing, because it seems like we're struggling in the dark with what to do about that. And it'd be interesting to get, to discuss that with other electoral areas on the island.
Okay. Would you like to perhaps submit some suggestions that you might have to me, and I'll make sure they get forwarded through to Director Wynn? Is that a reasonable course of action, or Director Davis?
I was wondering if you had a list of what had been discussed previously, because I know there's things like rural broadband and roads.
Roads, rural broadband, Director Marcotte, does any come to mind, some of the other items that have been discussed? Riparian has been discussed.
Roadside pathways.
Roadside and rural pathways has been discussed, so Director Marcotte? Microphone, please.
We do have, in the records somewhere, we could look that up, because we did have a long list, and it was maintained, the
Yeah.
material was kept, so I'll see if it's kind of short notice for it, because we are certainly very, very busy, and finding the staff person to find that information may be harder than we think, and then on the other hand, it could be very easy.
I think we've pretty much covered it. I think Director Davis's input and the like, so roadside rural pathways, riparian, the road contract, that sort of thing. So if you've got any suggestions, please forward them through to me, and I'll make sure that Director Wynn gets them for the upcoming convention. That, I believe, is the end of our new business items. Let me just double check. That brings us to question period.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I'm Cliff Evans from Shawnigan Lake. Mr. Chair, is there a plan from within the CVRD to amalgamate the OCPs for the electoral areas and the zoning bylaws? And if there is and it's in progress, could the public have an update?
My understanding is that there is a look at harmonization of OCPs in the areas that they can be harmonized. So just as one example is rural resource lands. We're looking to see what of those policies and guidelines can be harmonized so that it's a similar set of regulations throughout the regional district. Something brief to add, Mr. Tippett?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the chair for not dumping me. Yeah, just to add to what the chair has said, Cliff, the regional district has hired a senior planner. She'll be starting, another senior planner, I should add. She'll be starting in April, and she'll be tasked with putting together a bit of a work plan for this. So it's at the concept stage right now. The work plan will be brought before this committee. So more details will emerge as time goes on about what and how this may happen. So stay tuned, I guess, is what I would say.
Thank you, Mr. Tippett.
Mr. Chair, when the SIA fiasco came up, I think we in Shawnigan Lake got away from the 3520s and went to the 985 OCP. Now that that seems to be pretty well over, are we going to go back to our 3520, and are we going to bring our 3520s up to scratch?
Mr. Tippett?
I don't mind answering, Mr. Chair, or trying to. That was the original intent, Cliff, was once SIA had been resolved, in this case not entirely to our satisfaction, that we would be moving to repeal bylaw 985 and roll Area B into bylaw 3520. What's causing us to delay the onset of that is the idea that we're actually looking at the same time as these OCPs potentially being harmonized, in having a combined zoning bylaw. And so we don't want to do zoning amendments twice, you know, like a major amendment to incorporate Area B into a combined bylaw for areas A, B, and C, if we can combine areas A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I all at the same time. So it will be done. It just might not be imminent, and it'll be done in the context of that larger project. That's what we're going to plan or propose before this committee. So I'm kind of jumping ahead. I'm saying that's what the planners think we're going to do. The committee is going to have to agree to it. So that's where it's at. But one way or another, it will be done.
Thank you, Mr. Tippett.
Mr. Chair, I was just wondering about the wisdom of this because of amalgamating them all or harmonizing them. Because when we started off with the amalgamation of areas A, B, and C, we had 3 OCPs and 3 sets of zoning bylaws. When we were finished, I believe we ended up with 4 because each of the villages took on their own village OCP and zoning bylaws. And then we had the outside of the confinement area. So 3 became 4. Is this, if we have 9, what's it going to become?
Good question. I think it was a rhetorical question.
I don't think it was rhetorical. It's fact. It is, are we going to make something bigger?
Well, as Mr. Tipp has just explained, we haven't even begun to set the plan in place. So we'll obviously have a clearer picture as to what this will look like. You opened your comment with, you know, you wonder about the wisdom of it. Well, the wisdom of it will either be evident or it won't be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, on the highways improvements, I wonder if the electoral areas got together and put in a request to get some of the roads that we really need in our areas. Our roads around Shawnigan Lake, as you know, especially the West Road and East Shawnigan Lake Road, are really dangerous. And it seems to me that we're having more and more houses built out in that area, yet we don't have any real road improvement. And what I mean by real road improvement is there a possibility that the electoral areas can put in a request to get alternative roads or routes built, because it's really getting dangerous now.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. We brought this to the new minister's attention at UBCM, and I believe that that's probably the #1 priority of each of us around here, is to bring improvements to the roads to our individual communities. So whether or not we want to see if there's a way of consolidating and prioritizing a request from the electoral areas, that's something that we could discuss.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Seeing no one else in the audience, I would entertain a motion to resolve into closed session under Community Charter Part 4, Division 3, Section 90, under the item listed below. Moved by Director Kuhn, seconded by Director Marcotte. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. 5 minutes.